My name is Connor Echols. I'm the managing editor of the NonZero newsletter. We cover, lots of different international affairs issues from the point of view of kind of the idea that, there's this increasing connectivity for the world and that there are kind of extraordinary advantages to focusing on these non-zero sum outcomes, like win-win outcomes rather than doing kind of outcomes in which one side loses and focusing on those. My background before this, I worked as a reporter at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which is associated with the restraint movement in foreign policy. Did lots of reporting on a wide range of issues there. And during my previous time, I was focused on the Middle East, kind of in my educational background. So I speak Arabic, have generally focused on that region, but now report on international policy issues more broadly.
Cool. Well, welcome to the show. We're glad to have you on.
Yeah, thank you.
So just kind of kick things off, the situation that we're seeing in Ukraine currently is that the Ukrainian forces are doing not too well. Russia has been gaining ground. They've been doing that for the better part of this conflict. We're starting to see a kind of general acceptance in the West and the Western media that the original stated goals of the West in expelling Russia to pre-2014 borders is not likely to be the end outcome of this conflict, and we may have to go to some sort of diplomatic solution along the lines of what people were proposing years ago, something along the lines of the conflict freezes in place and perhaps Ukraine stays neutral and there's no Ukraine in NATO. The other day, I don't know if it was Friday or Saturday or Sunday, I couldn't keep track, but the Biden administration announced that they were going to reverse a position that they had preventing Ukraine from using long-range missiles, ATACMS missiles, to attack deep inside Russian territory. So not just in the conflict zone, but actually have the ability to go deep inside Russia itself. I'd like to get your thoughts on that decision by the Biden administration, kind of what their end game is there, because my understanding is this is not going to materially change the conflict, but it does escalate tensions with Russia. I think Russia responded by saying they now view NATO and the United States as a direct party in this conflict, if they weren't already. So greatly raising the sort of nuclear shadow over this conflict once again. So just the situation on the conflict, and what is the Biden administration's end goal? Is it to prevent the collapse of Ukraine before Trump gets in so Biden doesn't own it? I mean, I just can't wrap my head around why they would make that decision 2 months before they're out of office.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this decision is a reflection of the Biden administration's kind of broader problems with having never really set clear goals, clear achievable goals for their policies in Ukraine. So we've kind of seen this over and over again. The reason that this would be seen or perceived as escalatory, this idea that they can fire further into Russia, is because Russia has said so. Right. And Russia has kind of said over and over again at different moments throughout the conflict that there were these certain things that were either kind of red lines or significant, kind of escalatory measures that they felt were drawing them into closer direct conflict with the West. This is another one of those. And it's kind of naturally what happens. You get this slow kind of pulling forward of the tactics and the slow moving escalation when you have a situation where the Biden administration is kind of unwilling to set more practical goals or more realistic goals for the end of the conflict. And I mean, it's a real challenge for Ukraine because, they kind of get these individual small victories, right? They get this, oh, finally we can strike these targets further within Russia, or finally we can do this or that. And there's no real chance of that having a significant impact on the overall dynamics of the conflict, right? Like you pointed to, will this stave off collapse of Ukrainian lines or things like that? I mean, I would say definitely not, right? This is going to allow them to strike more deeply within Russia, maybe hit, weapons depots, hit more Russian infrastructure, which is seen, as a bit more of a direct sort of one-to-one with what the Russians have been able to do. But all it will do is kind of increase the temperature by another 5% and kind of keep the situation on the ground more or less the same.
Do you anticipate the Trump administration settling the conflict? I mean, during the campaign, Trump was never fully clear, I would argue, on his position on Ukraine. He had stated many times that it just never would have happened if he were in office. He said the same thing about Gaza, but it's not clear to me. I think a lot of his supporters interpreted that as he will end the conflict. J.D. Vance had an op-ed, I think it was in the Washington Post or the New York Times, about a year ago, proposing a solution for the Ukrainian conflict along the lines that I talked about a moment ago, kind of freezing the conflict in place and not having NATO as a part of Russia. But it's never been clear to me that Trump himself would do that. As Trump pointed out when he's defending himself against these attacks that he's a puppet of Putin, he was the first president that arms the Ukrainians against Russia. This is something the Obama administration had declined to do after Russia went into Crimea and the Donbass in 2014. Trump also had put sanctions on Russia and done a few other things. So it doesn't seem clear to me that he's the dove that a lot of his supporters hope he is. And given the foreign policy establishment's very anti-Russia position and the kind of apocalyptic rhetoric that we've heard for years on if Russia wins, quote unquote, they're going to march onto, I don't know, Poland and Paris and Lisbon or something like that. What do you anticipate the Trump administration doing on the conflict? Is it just going to be keeping on the same? I mean, something we've both mentioned a couple of times is the idea of Ukrainian collapse. Like, sooner or later, the status quo continue on.
Yeah, well, what you pointed to there at the end, I think, is really important, right? The status quo seems to a lot of people, to me, and to I think a lot of people from across kind of foreign policy reporting and the foreign policy establishment, even, like, it's clear that the status quo cannot continue. There are fundamental disadvantages that Ukraine has in terms of manpower, in terms of even defense production in relation to Russia, that will make it such that the longer this conflict lasts, the more challenging it will be for Ukraine to get anything resembling victory without significant escalation. And by significant escalation, I would mean like the actual involvement of NATO forces or forces from NATO countries or things like that, setting aside, nuclear escalation risks at that point. So the reason I use that as the introduction is that it's always hard to tell, but it's clear that he will be bringing a different perspective to the issue, right? He's got some kind of core aspects about his personality and about his approach that I think make it sincerely possible that he could end the conflict. I think what's most likely that we're going to see is having him, send forth probably more aid to Ukraine. I don't expect aid to Ukraine to immediately cut off. I expect him to do the kind of peace through strength thing where he goes and he says, hey, Putin, we are going to arm the hell out of Ukraine. We're going to do this or that. And maybe even something further than just arming them, maybe do this direct thing against you. And if you don't back down and enter peace talks that are at least on even terms, then we won't be able to, then, we'll do this and we'll defeat you one way or another. And I think that's the attitude that we've seen from Trump in different theaters, right? Like that was the logic behind Trump attempting to, Trump's assassination of an Iranian general in 2020 was very much based in that idea that this kind of escalate to de-escalate idea. So that's a thing that I think Trump is going to try to pursue. It's not super clear to me whether that will work, but it is very clear to me that what's happening right now is not working. Is not working in Ukraine's favor, is not leading to kind of a long-term security solution for Ukraine. So I think people should be a little open to the possibility that Trump could change things. I don't think that he's thinking about this in some super complicated way, but I think that he could reach a solution to the conflict for sure. It'll be an unattractive solution to a lot of people. That's going to be one of the big challenges because there's no world in which Trump comes in and somehow, does these things that I've kind of said already, I think are impossible without, NATO involvement, right? Which are taking back Crimea, taking back, much of the Donbass, things like that. So I think any peace deal will either involve kind of a freezing of the front lines and unofficial acknowledgement that is now Russian territory, but not formally Russian territory, or it will involve an actual concession of of land. I don't see a different path forward.
And what do you see the impacts of this conflict? Because from one perspective, it's been pretty detrimental to the United States or the United States interests in the idea that you've got one of the linchpins of Europe, Germany, kind of in a weaker economic state, which is people don't entirely but somewhat attribute to sanctions against Russia, loss of cheap fossil fuels, natural gas, that sort of thing, which raised prices for its industrial sector, which is a major part of the German economy. You have the Russian military in a much stronger position than it has been in at least a generation, if not more, because a generation ago was probably the 90s when it was in not a very good position at all. You have the Russians, in theory, closer to the Chinese, to the North Koreans, to Iran. And you also just have a failure of what were stated goals of the conflict by the United States of getting Russia out of back to the pre-2014 borders. So I don't think this matters that much, but a lot of people in the foreign policy establishment view this concept of credibility as very important. And so if the U.S. falls short of its goals, it's got a credibility problem that will, I don't know, in theory, make it weaker in the future. Is that a correct assessment? I mean, what do you see as how this conflict impacting the United States and U.S. interests?
Yeah, it's a really challenging question. I think that everything you've pointed to is true, right? It just depends on how the U.S. is thinking about what it wants to do in the world, right? What does it mean for the U.S. to strengthen or weaken, Europe through this conflict? There's kind of this Eastern European point of view that strengthening Europe must go through expelling Russian troops from an invasion of a European country. And then there's, I think, this sort of American and maybe German point of view that you're highlighting that says a lot of the stuff about needing to support Ukraine and arm them to the teeth and all this, but recognizes that there are significant challenges, both economically and geopolitically, associated with pursuing a really active conflict with a country that is capable of keeping up, maybe not in the sense that, Russia is able to defeat the West, but in that it's able to kind of just keep this war going. This is much more of a core interest to Russia than it is to the U.S. So there are a lot of trade-offs to be dealt with there. I guess another one that I might highlight that might speak to the foreign policy establishment more, and one that you're seeing from a lot of these incoming Trump officials, is this idea that this war is going to distract away both resources and attention from what is kind of the bigger geopolitical challenge of the 21st century in East Asia, dealing with China. So I think that there's all kinds of opportunity cost associated with this conflict. There's all kinds of reasons to be concerned. And one that I would add into is it has added, it's made climate change, maybe 10% harder to deal with. Or 20% harder to deal with, because that's one that I think doesn't always get brought in here. One result of this is that while Russia is still exporting the same amount, roughly, of oil and liquid natural gas as it was in the past, the U.S., in part because of all these things of the inability of European countries to get access to these goods, is now, doing more production and more exports of various fossil fuels to Europe. It slowed down the ability of all kinds of technology transfer. There's very little chance that Russia and the U.S. will be able to work together on anything, and climate change would be one of those issues that they wouldn't be able to, they'll certainly not be working on it while this is happening. So it really prevents us at that grander level from dealing with these major transnational issues.
Yeah, I think you even have Germany reopening a lot of coal plants because they no longer have cheap natural gas from Russia. They are getting more imports from the United States. I'd say the conflict has been a boon to, not just the Raytheons and the Lockheed Martins of the world, but also the LNG, the fossil fuel companies in the United States who have a more thirsty Europe for fossil fuels. So it's definitely part of the conflict that people are not seeing as much, but is a very unfortunate outcome. I did want to pivot, though, to the Middle East. Something that caught my eye recently was a UN Special Committee report that came out, I think, last week that stated in its conclusion, and I'm just going to read the quote so I have it exactly correct, The developments in this report lead the special committee to conclude that the policies and practices of Israel during the reporting period are consistent with the characteristics of genocide. I know that term is thrown around a lot. The International Court is doing its own investigation on genocide. This is just one special committee out of the United Nations, but certainly a very detailed and interesting way to look at the conflict, which is, I think, somewhat horrifying. What do you see, I guess, is the outcome there? We have what I would characterize as an ethnic cleansing campaign going on in Gaza, at least in the northern half of Gaza. When you go into the details of that report or many other reports, you just find Gaza's been completely destroyed. The population, enormous suffering, enormous death. And you have some Israeli ministers talking about, putting settlements back in, again, taking the northern half of Gaza. When, the Trump campaign had kind of made it known to Netanyahu that they want him to just kind of speed up the conflict. I think because it's just been bad PR is what we heard from Trump. Bad PR for Israel, and I doubt Trump even just wants to deal with it. I don't think he cares about the suffering in Gaza, but I think he wants the conflict just kind of wrapped up. Do you see that ending anytime soon? And then what does a post-conflict Gaza even look like?
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, the end point that you had there, what does a post-conflict Gaza look like? We kind of have no idea because we can't even imagine what it looks like for Israel to achieve its stated goal, which is the complete destruction and dismantlement of Hamas in Gaza, right? So that, it's very similar to, I had a piece about this recently that we initially ran in our newsletter and then an adapted version in the Washington Post as well, talking about this idea that like nation building is sort of back in vogue in this interesting way, right? These core ideas about having, the desire to completely remake another society through force has really come back in major ways during this past year of conflict. We're seeing it in Gaza, this idea that extraordinary military power, followed by some sort of kind of vaguely worded reconstruction, will allow Gaza to become this kind of prosperous hub in the future, this powerful thing in the future. It's really outlandish, right? We're seeing similar things in Lebanon where they're saying that this is an opportunity for the U.S. to push for a new political reality in Lebanon. And that's simply not going to happen. But the problem is that, the Biden administration has, as we've seen, demonstrably has been unwilling to sort of stand up to Israel in any serious way when it's pursuing some of its more kind of unusual or particularly brutal campaign. And Trump, I don't really see as being capable of standing up to Israel very much either. I think that the wild card in all of this is that this is obviously Trump's last term as president. He has a little bit less to worry about when it comes to donors. He has less to worry about when it comes to this sort of traditional Republican view that Israel must be kind of protected and defended in a way that's different from other countries, right? Because the U.S. has lots of allies that do things that Republicans will have good or bad feelings about, but Israel is kind of one where you're not, you really try to avoid any kind of real criticism, right? I think that there's a chance that Trump bucks that trend, but it would require this kind of extraordinary far-sighted vision that I don't really think we've seen from him as a political thinker. So no, I think there's a chance that the war in Lebanon ends at some point, mostly because I really don't understand how the Israeli military is going to be able to maintain a multi-front war for an extended period of time. They've already had to bring up all kinds of reservists over the past year, all kinds of people that wouldn't have expected necessarily to be fighting. I think that it's going to be really challenging for a country with a population as small as Israel's to even keep this kind of thing up for an extended period of time. But kind of getting back to my earlier point there about Gaza and rebuilding and a lack of goals, the war in Gaza just isn't going to really end, in a snap of a finger, I think. Israel will continue to have extraordinary security concerns arising from a place where they have now, done a lot to radicalize a lot of people even further than they already were. There will continue to be things like, attacks within Israel. There will continue to be people that want to fight back against any extended Israeli occupation of the region. Unless Israel kind of starts over and just completely withdraws from Gaza and does the same kind of fence it in approach that they had done for, however many years prior, 15, 20 years prior, there's just no real way that this ends in any kind of concrete way.
So you said there's a small chance that Trump kind of bucks the trend on Israel, but I'm wondering what that even looks like. I mean, a lot of people think that the two-state solution is completely dead. Kind of anyone that you talk to on the ground there has that perspective, given that the West Bank has somewhere between 600,000 and 800,000 settlements now. During the conflict with Gaza, Israel's been escalating attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank, continuing expanding settlements apace. I mean, I guess in theory, they could freeze settlement expansion for a period of time, but it's clearly a long-term project. So it's hard for me to envision what a different reality would look like. What is your perspective on like a different change of course that could go vis-a-vis the U.S. and Israel?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of a long-term shift toward, in perspective on the fundamental political problem that you're pointing to, I don't see a possibility of Trump changing much there at all, right? That's a little bit different. I mean more the sort of immediate term actual fighting going on in that sense. But what you're pointing to is true, right? This idea that there can be a stable two-state solution, that it's just around the corner, and that there's going to be some sort of resolution to this conflict that is this interesting, very well managed and very carefully planned thing. I just think that that's extremely unlikely at this point as well. Anyone who's spent time, I've spent time in the West Bank for sure. I've spent time both in settlements and in everything from like refugee camps, settlement, regular towns and city. There is no feasible way without extraordinary human suffering that I don't really think anyone is super in a rush to initiate to remove either, the Palestinians from that land or the Jewish settlers from that land. There's no practical way to separate those two polities. They are fundamentally connected now. So the question that will be faced over the long term is whether there is a willingness to pursue kind of a binational state, a state that, that does contain the whole area, but that actually allows Palestinians to be full citizens with full representation. I think that is unlikely as well. Certainly in the short term, I think we might see a kind of South Africa-like, 60, 70 year multi-generational project that might culminate in that. Nora Erakat is a famous Palestinian American human rights lawyer who has a book about that people could check out if they want more on that issue. But I don't really see anything happening under Trump that accelerate the path to a political solution, except insofar as it accelerates the problems, right? So Trump, I think, is very likely or reasonably likely to accept greater settlement expansion. I think he's reasonably likely to accept the full annexation of either Israeli settlements in the West Bank or the entire West Bank to Israel. And that is definitely the fervent hope of Israeli officials right now. You can see that in what they're saying. The new Israeli defense minister, Israel Katz, said after one of his first meetings that he was hoping to use this opportunity to strike out against Iran. And then you've got Smotrich, who is the finance minister, who's saying that this is an important opportunity to finally nationalize, to finally annex these settlements. And they're seeing this as a real moment to kind of go all out. So I think that, to the extent that Israeli opinion is the thing that's driving what's happening, they feel very emboldened right now. And it'll kind of be up to Trump personally to decide whether he wants to continue that trend. But I mean, it's the prospects for any long-term solution. The only thing, kind of to get back to what I was saying there, that could speed up any kind of solution would just be the idea that they're speeding it up by making it worse, right? That annexing the West Bank will force a full apartheid-like situation or a full apartheid situation throughout the country that will eventually, over the course of, again, 60, 70 years, lead to some sort of civil rights-like or apartheid-like resolution. So that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah, and I want to dig a little deeper on that because you hear about this idea of Israel formally annexing the West Bank. And when I hear that, I think in some ways that is worse for Israel, at least sort of reputationally, or the optics of it, because you have had formal Israeli control of the West Bank since 1967. You've had this settlement activity that basically began right away and is now just under 1 million people there. But when people accuse Israel of being an apartheid state, they point out to the status of Arabs in Israel proper, and the West Bank is treated as this separate entity. I don't even think that you're not supposed to call it an occupation anymore, but it's this separate entity kind of on the side of Israel. But if they formally annex the whole of the West Bank, and so not just the settlements, but the whole of the West Bank, doesn't that just disappear the mirage that it's not a part of Israel? And once you have that, to your point, how do you deny that it's an apartheid state anymore if you have these Jewish-only roads that Arab Muslims can't go on, if you have, housing restrictions, all the trappings of a formal apartheid state? I would think that would be somewhat worse for Israel reputationally, but maybe it doesn't matter. I mean, it doesn't seem like a country that cares too much about its reputation outside the halls of power in the United States, where it's has a pretty good reputation, and that doesn't seem to ever be at risk.
Yeah, Israel clearly, the general kind of center of gravity in Israel of public opinion is that the world fundamentally misunderstands Israel, fundamentally misunderstand kind of the longer history of the Jewish people and the need of the Jewish people to be protected against these security threats. And I think that's only been doubled down in this past year, right? Because there's a really deep belief among most people within Israel that they are being completely wrongfully maligned for what they're doing in Gaza, that they face real security issues that need real solutions. And that's what you will hear if you talk about these potential reputational costs, right? They are going to, not everyone in Israel obviously is in favor of annexation of the West Bank, but there's many that are, and they'll argue that, on top of it being necessary from this sort of political perspective, they'll add that, this makes sense from a security perspective. When I've talked to, Israeli, military officers and people like that, they'll sometimes talk about how, if Israel doesn't have the West Bank, then it's about, you look at a map, it's like an inch wide, or it's like half an inch wide. That's kind of the argument, right? It's true that if they don't hold on to that over the long term, then Israel will have a 20-mile wide section that goes down the middle, or 20 or 30 miles wide, like genuinely very small. So I think that they're going to focus a lot more on the security aspects, and I think that they'll argue that they are simply doing what they have to do to protect their country. I think it's an extremely bad idea to focus that narrowly, right? Because these are these very short-term issues that don't acknowledge that the primary security challenge that Israel faces is secondary to the political challenge that we're talking about, right? Like the political problem that, the fact that there are, however many million, 7, 8 million Palestinian who are not meaningfully enfranchised, who are more or less stateless, that are living in these places, that live under really challenging conditions, and who simply want to kind of live on the territory of their ancestors. That political problem won't go away. But I think that they have a belief that they can solve that political problem through security means and through military means. And I just don't see, I think to a certain extent, the idea of a two-state solution was always pretty fanciful, right? It was this idea put forth by international actors that thought that somehow a Palestinian state made up of, sort of East Jerusalem plus the West Bank plus Gaza would somehow be able to live kind of naturally alongside a rump Israel as well. When you just look at a map, it doesn't make any sense, right? It's this very unusual plan that sort of ignores political reality. And it was the same during the Oslo process. I think it was the same, even when this was talked about during the 2000s. I don't think that a two-state solution at this point, or perhaps at any point, is like workable or practical.
Yeah, and you hear that a lot, and yet you have this Saudi peace plan, which I think was first put out in 2002. It's kind of representative of the of many Arab states, not all the Arab states, but many of the Arab states, that says in exchange for Israel allowing a two-state solution along the parameters that you mentioned, Saudi Arabia and other Arab states who've signed on to this will normalize relations with Israel, have full diplomatic relations, all that stuff. Saudi Arabia recently reiterated that position. There was this idea that following the Abraham Accords under the Trump administration, that Saudi Arabia was kind of on its way to normalizing relations with Israel, and this was the next step. And there's this idea that, at least in part, Hamas was reacting to that because they were being left out of this conversation when they made their attack on October 7th. But Saudi Arabia, I think it was within the last year, restated this position that they're not going to normalize relations with Israel absent a two-state solution. Do you take that seriously from the Saudis? And the thought behind that question is, for the sort of implicit protest behind that statement from Saudis that they are in favor of political rights for the Palestinians, you really don't see much beyond some rhetorical protest, that sort of thing, from the Arab states about what is a pretty dire situation going on in Gaza. And the blockade that Israel instituted in, I think it was beginning 2007, there's always been a border with Egypt. I think it's the Rafah crossing in Egypt, another, effectively client state of the United States, gets military aid from the United States, has always kind of participated, at least, I guess since Camp David in the late 70s, always kind of participated in this situation, in enforcing this situation with Israel. And, you have the Jordanians. I think a majority of the Jordanian population might be Palestinian, and Jordan's always been concerned about, that population, what to do with them. So on the one hand, you have, again, these kind of rhetorical statements from the Arab states like Saudi Arabia saying we want a two-state solution. But on the other hand, you kind of wonder, do you really care? Israel's this advanced, wealthy state. It's trying to have economic relationships with these Arab states, which are led by dictators that have either security agreements or economic agreements with the United States. They trade all their oil in dollars, that kind of thing. What do you make of that situation with the Arab states? Are they allies of the Palestinians, or is this all just to quell their own domestic populations?
Well, there's a lot to kind of pick apart there, but where I might start is, you've accurately identified this pattern throughout the region where there's a significant disconnect between the sort of these like autocratic leaders who are very, transactional in their politics, who are practical, who see the U.S. as their most important kind of partner and thus see Israel as a necessary one, and who would kind of like to get over all of these different problems that the kind of Israel-Palestinian crisis has allowed to fester throughout the region. But then you've got these publics that are seriously passionate and seriously engaged on the issue of the Palestinian struggle for self-determination, right? You mentioned Jordan. Amman itself, the capital of Jordan, I lived there for, a collective year and a half over the years or so, is like probably 90% Palestinian in Amman itself, and then the country as a whole is probably 50 or 60%. And so there's this enormous commitment to that cause. But there is, on the flip side, this huge hangover from the Arab Spring, where a lot of people are very, very afraid of instability and are very, very afraid of anything leading to a potential conflict within their country, either as a civil war or as a multinational war that happens across borders. And that fear of greater conflict has, especially in Jordan and in states like Saudi Arabia, made it very difficult for activists to do really much at all in terms of critiquing the government, especially when it comes to issues around Palestinian rights and things like that. They'll be allowed to protest about these things, but they are very fearful that civil unrest could spread and could turn into a civil war that would lead them to live like they've seen their neighbors in Syria living for these past, almost 15 years now, 13 years. And how people have been living in Iraq. So the question of whether these leaders actually care about the Palestinians, the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS is often how you'll hear him referred to. I don't think he like sheds particular tears for it, right? I don't think that he sits around and worries about Palestinian self-determination and about human rights violations committed by Israel. I think that his father, King Salman, who's technically still the leader, but who has had failing health for a long time, may be one of the last things preventing MBS from kind of shifting even more kind of towards the Western Bloc and even more kind of in favor of normalization with Israel. But it does pose a political challenge regardless because, MBS was about to try to pursue this actual kind of normalization deal prior to October 7th, or at least that's what the Biden administration fervently hoped. And this past year has made it such that public opinion really does require that you have to at least pretend to deal with the Palestinian problem first before you get to normalization. So I think that we'll have a little bit of that, but I think if current trends continue within 5 or 10 years, I don't see any reason at all that Saudi Arabia will continue to not recognize Israel, and I don't envision the Palestinian cause being saved in that time. So, I guess the answer there would be I don't think that they will end up standing up in the end. I think that they will, over time, slowly just be able to let it happen and normalize relations without any fundamental change to the Israel-Palestine conflict.
And then looking at Iran, so you've got Iran and Israel have had kind of a tit for tat on missile exchanges. I think fairly restrained on both sides intentionally as to kind of not escalate the conflict. But even outside the relationship with Israel, I'm wondering your thoughts on the relationship with the United States. We've had not good relations with Iran since the revolution in '79 and the hostage taking, all that sort of thing. There were potential openings for a better relationship, some conversations in the 90s. And then I think the Iranians had made an overture after 9/11 to kind of have better relations with the United States, unsurprisingly rejected by the George W. Bush administration. You had the nuclear agreement with the Obama administration. Trump pulled out. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Biden administration actually started going stronger against the Iranians in terms of pressuring them, and so not trying to go back to the nuclear agreement, the JCPOA that Obama had put in, and then Trump coming in is, I don't know, there's some, what I would say is some dubious intelligence that Iran was trying to kill Trump on the campaign trail. I don't know how true that is, whether or not it is. How do you see relations with Iran playing out under the Trump administration, but just in the future? Like, how do we get to just a normal relationship with Iran? Does it have to be a different regime that is not an Islamic state?
A normal relationship with Iran starts with a normal relationship with Israel, is what I would say. We need to kind of be able to pull back and have a broader vision for how American interests can be served by a more stable Middle East. And part of that would be taking steps to seek, to not empower the states that are doing the most destabilizing stuff, which is to say Israel right now, and to a similar extent Iran, though to a lesser extent, to be honest, right? What Israel's done has particularly destabilized the Middle East here. So if you want to have a U.S. policy that is able to properly normalize with Iran and is able to take advantage of, the fact that Saudi Arabia and Iran have normalized relations and are talking and are exchanging diplomatic visits and things like that during these crises that could genuinely help keep a lid on things and help prevent regional war, you're going to have a pullback in U.S. focus on Israeli national security interests and an emphasis on the broader American interest of stability in the region that can only be built by actual, not interfered with by the U.S., to a significant extent, engagement between regional parties that are able to find a balance of power that they can live with going forward, right? So I that's kind of like a you must first, invent the universe answer to the problem, but I don't really see a way that we can have more normal relations with Iran unless we can kind of pull back from that reflexive emphasis on Israel's security that I think warps our view of the sort of strategic landscape within the Middle East. I think Trump, on the narrower question of, could we see maximum pressure and then a return to some sort of deal or things like that? I think that's not impossible. It's going to be really challenging. The Biden administration, I think, did sincerely come in wanting to potentially return to something like the JCPOA. I don't think that they took the steps that they should have in order to pursue that path. I've written about that. I don't think that either Jake Sullivan or Tony Blinken were really in that was not super high on their priority list. I think that there were lots of other small challenges between the U.S. and Iran that made things complicated. And then the potential for any big foreign policy initiative was pretty much dashed as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine, and that became sort of the center of the universe for the second half of the Biden administration. And so, that I would say that to a certain extent, events intervened in that case, and who knows if Biden would have been able to get a new deal if he had been more serious about pursuing one. I think it's possible, but it would have been challenging. Trump, it's just, if you think that his sort of peace through strength, escalate to de-escalate thing, if you think that works, which I have misgivings about, I have doubts about, but is possible. It's a theory of the world that a lot of people believe in. Then there's a chance, yes, that there could be normalized relations, or not normalized relations, but like made more normal in the colloquial sense, right? That it could become less truly chaotic and less, always on the brink of war between the U.S. And Iran. And there could be genuine restrictions on the Iranian nuclear program. And I don't think that requires a change from the sort of extremely unusual governance structure that Iran lives under. There's a lot of, Marco Rubio is poised to be Secretary of State. He is someone that has actively throughout his career sought the destruction of the Islamic Republic per se, right? He's wanted to replace that regime and have one that is different, I guess, to come after. But the possibility of actually pursuing that kind of goal seems pretty remote to me. The idea that you, with anything short of a direct invasion, could topple the Iranian regime is pretty unlikely to me. And I don't think that they are going to want to actually invade Iran because, as people have talked about in all kinds of contexts, fighting Iran is very different than fighting, for example, Iraq. Totally different topography, totally different kind of military challenges. It would be a really hard fight if the U.S. wanted to do that. And as I've talked about earlier, you don't really know what's going to come after. So I think that would be a very dumb policy. But I don't see the regime... I don't see U.S. actions leading to the fall of the Islamic Republic anytime soon, and I do think that there will just have to be a modus vivendi.
So then jumping further east to East Asia, China is another big flashpoint. It feels like in the halls of power in D.C., everyone's a war hawk these days when it comes to China. The Biden administration effectively ended the one China policy with regard to Taiwan. We've had this... I don't know if you would call it informal or formal policy that the U.S. only recognizes one China and that effectively Taiwan is not this independent sovereign state. Biden, for the first time, I think, explicitly committed the United States to the defense of China. I feel like the Trump administration may have hinted that they would do that, but Biden was pretty explicit about that. You had, I think, some what people call provocative movements, like Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan and making these statements. I think Kevin McCarthy might have gone to Taiwan too. But so it's, we keep hearing from both parties, like, we've got to get ready for war with China. China is going to be equipped to invade Taiwan by 2025. We've got to arm Taiwan more than they already are, and that sort of thing. And, there's a lot of China hawks, including Rubio, coming into positions of power if they're confirmed early next year. Where do you see this? I don't want to call it a conflict, but potential conflict. Like, is there any way we can just go back to having a normal relationship with China? Or is this China's rise a kind of prelude to war the way like Kaiserreich Germany was or something like that? Like, is it always when a new power rises, there's going to be one of these conflicts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a believer in there's this sort of academic theory that you're hinting at there called the Thucydides trap, based in this, this historical book about the Peloponnesian War that makes a similar set of arguments, or kind of demonstrates this idea that when a great new superpower, a new great power rises, it inevitably leads to conflict. There is a lot of evidence that it leads to severe tensions, right? And that it can lead to conflict. The Cold War is a very clear example of the ways in which it can lead to something that doesn't resemble war in the way that we traditionally think about it, but that is extremely destabilizing, extremely unpleasant, and only ended when the Soviet Union literally collapsed, right? So that's foreboding. There are definitely negative signals. I think that American politicians, I can't tell, the extent to which it's a deeply held belief that China is a threat that we must deal with in kind of all things, because, in a time where it's very hard to get things passed through Congress, in a time where it's very hard to justify things that will get bipartisan support, saying that you're doing it to fight China gets a lot of support. Saying that your AI policy is based around defeating China in AI leads to more support in Congress, leads to bills getting passed, leads to things like the Chips and Science Act that would otherwise be difficult. So there's that kind of like mechanic playing out that incentivizes you to continue doing these kind of provocative things towards China. I don't think that war between the US and China is inevitable at all, but I do think that the Trump administration is likely to make it more likely. I think that they will take more steps beyond what the Biden administration already has to sort of undermine China's economic goals. They're going to do more to restrict, I'm sure, China's access to not just strategic goods, but probably to a wider range of things. I could see more separation of the economies, and I could see more hawkish rhetoric around Taiwan for sure. I don't think Trump himself, I've thought about this, I've gone back and forth on this. I think a lot of people around Trump would intervene directly or would like to intervene directly to defend Taiwan in the case of an invasion. I don't know if Trump himself would do that. He has this sort of interesting instinct that he seems to sort of balk at bloodshed. He seems to sort of balk at the idea of being seen as losing, actual soldiers in a situation. And I think the idea that he would go and send U.S. troops to fight and defend Taiwan just seems a little bit outlandish to me. I think that he would not be overly moved by the sort of impressive track record of the one China policy that you mentioned, right? This policy whereby, and it's connected to this other policy that's referred to as strategic ambiguity, which is this idea that the U.S. always says that it could intervene on Taiwan's behalf in case of an invasion, and that acts as a deterrent, right? So it's unclear whether the U.S. will do so, but the possibility that it could acts as this kind of stabilizing deterrent that prevents anyone on either side from making big moves. Because one thing that people forget is that these policies are also designed in part to discourage Taiwan from unilaterally declaring independence or doing any other types of thing that would tend to lead to further escalation. I don't know. There's a lot of different factors at play there, but it's going to just be a really hard to imagine challenge. Like if you thought that the Ukraine war was difficult and that it stretched supply chains in the West and that it revealed weaknesses in the defense industrial base that have been going on for a long period of time, a war over Taiwan would be 10 or 100 or 1,000 times worse on so many different levels. And the U.S., if it directly participates, will lose tens to hundreds of thousands potentially of soldiers. Like sincerely, that's not based on just total, making it up or things like that. That's based on just what we've seen in war games over Taiwan. In the first couple moves of most, popular public war games, like the Center for Strategic and International Studies carried out in 2023, China sinks one or two American aircraft carriers. Right. And an aircraft carrier is a floating city. That's 10,000 soldiers lost at sea. Right. And I think that that's just going to be a really challenging conflict for someone like Trump to actually want to fight through. It would be a scale of conflict that the U.S. hasn't been involved with really since Vietnam. And so I think it would be really challenging. I think that Trump, through his rhetoric and through his policies, will make that war more likely. But I also don't think that he is likely to step in and defend Taiwan.
What do you think a broader Trump foreign policy would look like in the second Trump administration? Because you've got, again, this idea that, he's not, as you said, he's kind of squeamish about direct conflicts. He's been critical on the campaign trail. He made himself famous, not famous, but made himself endeared to a lot of people in the 2016 Republican primaries when he denounced the war in Iraq, attacked the George W. Bush administration for not protecting the U.S. on 9/11, but was a critic of U.S. foreign policy over the last 10 years as being overly ambitious and kind of the U.S. focusing on wars overseas. During the campaign trail, he denounced Liz Cheney and her father, who Kamala Harris was campaigning around with, calling them warmongers who just want to kill Arabs. During his presidency, he was also critical of John McCain and also Lindsey Graham, who's a close ally of his, for being kind of warmongers who just never met a country they didn't want to bomb. So you get this idea that he is for a kind of more restrained foreign policy, but his incoming cabinet, if they're approved, is pretty hawkish. So we talked about Marco Rubio. There's Pete Hegseth at Defense, if he gets approved, it seems pretty hawkish as well. Incoming National Security Advisor. Is it Mike Waltz? Is that it?
Right.
So he's got a reputation for being pretty hawkish on all the conflicts that we've mentioned. All these people hawkish on Russia, wanting Ukraine to kind of push to the end. I think they've curtailed their statements in the last year, but they're deeper history on the Middle East, on China. So it kind of makes one wonder how much of Trump's rhetoric was real or whether it was just campaign bravado or lack of bravado, rather, and what we're going to see is a kind of more hawkish foreign policy.
Yeah, I think part of the key to all of this is that, you know, Trump is perceptive in that he sees that there's this really sincere split on the right between what might be called, you know, some version of foreign policy restraint and some version of this traditional sort of hawkish consensus that's mostly based around this idea of, you know, big military, don't be afraid to use it. You know, the U.S. goes it alone and will be strong alone because we're the most powerful country in the world, right? So that's obviously different from this new restraint movement. He's, I think, tried to almost distribute bounty to different parts of these movements and to do sort of this like the way that a political boss in a city would have in like the early 1900s, right? He's looking at constituencies and he's giving things to that. But in this case, I do think that he has heavily calibrated it towards the hawkish side, with some of these early picks. I don't know how he's doing this mental math or if he is doing it the same way, right? But like you said, Waltz, Rubio, and Hegseth are all quite hawkish. Rubio and Waltz have said more restraint-oriented things on Ukraine. They've expressed a desire for that conflict to come to an end, or at least to have concrete plans. But they're still, they're more traditional hawk. The biggest disappointment was that no one, not necessarily for me personally, because I'm of the left, so I don't particularly like any of these guys too much. But for restrainers, a big disappointment was Elbridge Colby not getting any of these real blue chip jobs. So, they ended up giving the main things to the Hawks. They've given some people associated with restraint to one extent or another. Tulsi Gabbard, for example, they've given her a job over at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. She will be the next Director of National Intelligence, assuming that she can get through Senate confirmation, which is a big if, is definitely a big if. But she's probably kind of the biggest fig leaf to that group. But again, all of this just so depend, there's lots of research that's tried to determine, do presidents make decisions based on their own view of the world or based on the views of their advisors or some mix. There was interesting research that I wrote about earlier this year that was kind of highlighting the role that advisors play. It seems that advisors are able to, by shaping the options on the table for a president and by doing, by the way in which they describe things, the way in which they advocate for things, do a significant amount of kind of shaping the decision-making for presidents. And if that's true, then yes, I'll expect Trump to be potentially more hawkish even in this term than he was in the first one. But at the same time, Trump has there's this X factor where he at any moment could decide, like he did with North Korea in 2018, that he wants to pursue normalization and that he wants to kind of buck everyone and make everyone really mad, but go and try to do this personal one-on-one deal with a foreign leader. And so there's a chance that at any moment, for any of these conflicts, that Trump will do that, right? That he'll stop listening to his advisors, or he'll tell his advisors, you work for me, you're loyal to me, we're going to do this, we are going to try to to the extent that he sees opportunities for that, I think he'll pursue it. But I don't think that Trump, I don't think Trump is ideological about foreign policy in the sense that I don't think Trump has an ideal vision of how the world works, right? I don't think he's factoring that into his decision making. I think that he wants to do things that advance his personal interests and that advance his read of the interests of the United States in very transactional and very individualized circumstances that act more like business dealings than they do like traditional international negotiations or conflicts. So yeah, I think that the kind of general Trump foreign policy perspective will be, frenetic. I think it'll jump back and forth between different things. I think that it will not make coherent sense from the outside, and I think that's because of who Trump is as a person, or how he's shown himself to be.
And then what about the Democrats? Because under the Biden administration, it felt very much like a neo-Conish foreign policy. You had these kind of neoconservative acolytes dating back to the George W. Bush administration, people like Victoria Nuland and Elliott Abrams. And, we talked about Harris campaigning with Liz Cheney, but in the actual policies of people who were in the administration, of which Liz Cheney was not, it felt very hawkish, very aggressive. The seemingly accurate thwarting of diplomatic overtures with the Ukraine conflict, going all in, supporting Israel as it attacks Gaza and Lebanon and Syria and Iran and Yemen, the hawkish attitude toward China. It feels very not exactly a peaceful, rules-based order international policy, despite their own rhetoric on that. You talked a moment ago about what influences foreign policy. Is it the advisors and the machinery of government versus the president himself? But there's also this idea that foreign policy does not change that much between administrations, between parties. It kind of reflects more the internal power dynamics of a state itself. And so I'm wondering, is it possible for the Democrats to have a materially different foreign policy than that of Trump administration, but also the Biden administration, and one that, actually does follow international law and try and respect human rights? Or are we just kind of, follow the same pattern that we've been following?
I mean, I would like us to obviously change patterns. I think the most likely result, in most situations is that things will continue roughly as they've been. And there's been a broad sort of foreign policy consensus that views, that has a very wide view of U.S. interests. This is the sort of fundamental difference between people who view themselves as pro-restraint and people who are maybe internationalists, or there's a lot of different words that people will use. But in order for the U.S. to pursue a lot of the goals that I think both you and I would like it to pursue, it'll require a narrowing of those goals, right? We can't really lower the defense budget right now unless we also lower what we want to do with our military, and kind of restrict that and take a different perspective on how the U.S. Will act in the world. The possibility of something like that happening in the near term is relatively low. I think that those types of change tend to kind of come after major crises, truly major crises, right? We wouldn't have the modern world order if not for World War II. They would have seen little reason to create something like the UN, to create these sort of the Fourth Geneva Conventions, things like that, that gave us a lot of this modern aspects of international law that restrict state behavior to a certain extent. I think it's fairly unlikely that the U.S. really does anything fundamentally different unless there's a significant external shock, or a shock that maybe could be caused internally, but that has external reverberations. I would hope that it could change, just through force of us arguing that it should, and I hope it does, right? That's a lot of what I spend my time doing, is arguing that we should narrow our view of our national interests, that we should we'll narrow them in certain ways and widen them in others, right? It is in U.S. interests for states to comply with international law, right? The U.S. has a disproportionate influence over the creation and the kind of monitoring of international law, and why don't we press our advantage on that, right? Like we should be encouraging and demanding of our allies, like Israel, for example, that they comply with the laws of war, that they allow food into Gaza, as they obviously should be doing, right? Those things also redound to our benefit, but the broader picture is that, you know, we have to change that top line mindset about what the U.S. military and what U.S. power is seeking to actually do in the world. And that's part of what really worries me with the China competition, is it's this attitude that the goal of U.S. power is sort of simply to continue reproducing hegemony, is to continue reproducing military predominance and true dominance in all theaters. You know, China and what we do about the rise of China will give us a good indication of if the U.S. can change on that front without, again, something traumatic happening, because, you know, it makes eminent sense for the U.S. to enter into a more equitable balance of power with China in East Asia in order to avoid war, but it means kind of rejecting this more primacist idea that the U.S. should be able to be the main one, guaranteeing shipping lanes, for example, in all theaters across the world, or that it should have things like complete freedom of navigation in all places, or that it must be able to dominate and project power in a way that no state can even do within its region, but do that in other regions rather than our own, which is obviously highly secure, right? We don't face national security risks close to home in any meaningful sense. So yeah, there needs to be a really broad rethinking of what of what the U.S. like wants to do in the world for these things to change.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, because it raises the question for me on what an ideal foreign policy would look like for me and for, you know, many people of the left, versus a kind of just realism on the reality of the world that we live in. And so just examples of that, like, I would love it if the U.S. said to Israel, you know, you've got to follow not just international law, but, you know, human rights issues. You've got to give political rights to the Palestinians, and similarly went to a lot of these autocratic regimes in the Middle East and said that as well. And that doesn't mean we, you know, invade them. If we're not going to invade Saudi Arabia if they are not giving people the right to vote, but we're not going to be chummy with them. And so having that kind of foreign policy is ideal in my head. But then I kind of wonder, so then what if the repercussions of that are Israel and maybe Saudi Arabia and these other states just form closer relationships with China and Russia, and then all of a sudden you see those kinds of bases in the Middle East, and you see oil being traded in you know, rubles and that kind of thing instead of dollars, and you start to see, you know, one could make the argument the reason we haven't had another Arab oil embargo, one, because is we have these autocratic regimes who are very economically intertwined with the United States. We talked about, you know, they give military aid to Egypt, so it's kind of paying them off. So if we do put on a more kind of squishy heart foreign policy that I'd like to see, are there negative repercussions for the United States? And I recognize it kind of goes back to what you're saying about it depends on how you define the interests of the United States, and do we want to enforce military control over the world? But I don't know. How do you resolve that kind of tension that when we seek these kinds of things, if we really push human rights everywhere, we're really just going to start to lose control and our influence of everywhere? And should we even have that control and influence?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. You're pointing to a real tension and a real challenge. I guess I would say, you know, to the specific human rights question, my view of that is that we should be in the business of rhetorically encouraging human rights and trying to get human rights like labor protections and things like that into global trade treaties and into things like that. But we should, to a certain extent, this is kind of the more kind of realist, like foreign policy realist, not realist in the colloquial sense, side of me, which is that we should, by and large, not do a ton to intervene in the internal affairs of a given state, right? To the extent that those internal affairs don't cross a certain line, because obviously there are lines that can be crossed. I think that, you know, I wouldn't consider even under the most, laissez-faire approach, I wouldn't consider what Israel's doing in Gaza. It's like an internal affair that we can just look to the side at, right? Like we do have to take that seriously, and we do have to think about that. I just don't think that the world is quite, I think that the way that you framed the question is sort of derived from this more Cold War mindset that I think worked a little bit better when there was a distinct idea of a first, second, and third world, right? They were really distinct blocks. You had different advantages from being a part of them, and the states that were going towards one block or another were way, way weaker than the US or the Soviet Union or any other state that might want to enforce like participation in either of their blocks, right? Today, a state like Saudi Arabia not just wants to deal with both the West and China, it will. Saudi Arabia has genuine power on the world stage as sort of what, international relations scholars will refer to as middle powers, right? These kind of sort of free agents of the international system that have a certain amount of power. They're not a great power. They're not like the United States. They're not like China. They don't have the ability to pursue expansive strategic goals that change the international system fundamentally, but they do have the ability to deal with both great power, like in this situation, the two great powers, which is the US and China, and to seek advantages from both of them. So the extent to which the US over the next however many years will attempt to make sure that Saudi Arabia remains in our camp and that they stay on our side, it's just not going to create some durable thing where Saudi Arabia won't, just like, in the snap of a finger, turn and work with China at the same time, because they get benefit and in their, pursuit of their national interest will have a ton of reason to make pragmatic decisions about their relationship with each country. The only way that you could take it further and make it, if you want to really make them sort of not fully like a vassal state or anything, but like, a state with a close relationship would be to offer full security guarantees or things like that. That's a little bit of a different thing. If you're saying that you'll protect them against enemy attacks or that you'll come to their defense in the case of a war. But no, I don't think that there's very much the U.S. can do today to shape the preferences over the long term of a lot of these middle powers. I mentioned Saudi Arabia, but other examples. Israel's a bit of an odd case. Israel already has a decent relationship with China, actually, and an okay relationship with Russia at that. And that hasn't led to terrible issues for the U.S. But India is another major example of this. I mean, the BRICS countries, right? And this expanded BRICS. I guess Saudi Arabia isn't going to be a part of it anymore, or, I forget. They went back and forth. But, Brazil, India, South Africa, all of these countries have much more power than they did the first time around during the first Cold War. And I just don't think that they are going to pick a side in a recognizable way this time around.
Well, Connor, I really appreciate you coming on. I know we went all over the world on this and left out actually most of the world, including a lot of the BRICS countries, the entirety of the Western Hemisphere, that sort of thing. But appreciate all of your perspectives and insight. It was a real pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And can you just remind us, I know you said at the top of the call, but where people can follow your work?
Yeah, for sure. So if you want to see my writing mainly, that's going to be at the NonZero newsletter on Substack. I'll occasionally write elsewhere, but that's the main one. And then my Twitter handle, I think, is just my first name followed by my last name, but I should double check that before I say that. Yeah, it's Connor_Echols. So, feel free to follow me there as well.
And we will put that in the show notes. All right.
Much appreciated. Thank you.